Cleansing the Doors of Perception by Huston Smith. Psychedelic Theophanies and the Religious Life, Chapter 3. Psychedelic experiences can be religious. Subjects often say that they are, and their reports can be read like accounts of classic theophanies. What concerns me here is their staying power. No theophany is certain to retain its force. Backsliding, falling from grace, and the psalmist's lament, "Restore unto me the joy of my salvation," are not discoveries of the psychedelic age, and psychedelic theophanies can have some staying power among alcoholics in Saskatchewan, lawbreakers, Laguna Beach, California, severe neurotics, Spring Grove State Hospital, Maryland, and terminal cancer patients, Chicago and Spring Grove. Nevertheless, I suspect that psychedelic religious experiences are having, and for the foreseeable future will continue to have, less faith-filled carryover than those that occur spontaneously. I say this less for inductive than deductive reasons. With too little available data at this point for any inductive conclusion, my pessimism derives from the following syllogism. Major premise. Religious history suggests that for theophanies to take hold, certain conditions must obtain. Minor premise. Those conditions are lacking in the psychedelic movement. Conclusion. Psychedelic theophanies are not likely at this juncture of history to have substantial staying power. What are the conditions that are needed for theophanies to take hold? The most important one is conviction, carrying over into the non-drug state, that the insights that emerge in the theophany are true, that a theophany's disclosures seem true while the theophany is in progress follows by definition. It would not be a theophany, but some kind of other experience where it would be otherwise. As René Daumal, D-A-U-M-A-L, says, at that moment comes certainty. Speech must now be content to wheel in circles around that bare fact. The experience's content is certain because doubts could enter only from the perspective of this world, which world pales before, where it is not obliterated by, the world into which the seer has stepped. Okay, let me read that sentence again. That's hard to understand. The experience's content is certain because doubts could enter only from the perspective of this world, which world pales before, open brackets, where it is not obliterated by, close brackets, the world into which the seer has stepped. Except in the tragic case of psychotics, however, this world eventually reasserts itself, and its claims press hard upon us, which claims in our culture challenge the validity of pharmacological theophanies. The two foremost Western models of the mind are those of hard science, in brackets, artificial intelligence and its chemical counterpart, and soft science, in brackets, depth psychology with Freudianism in the lead. Both of these stand ready to explain chemically assisted convictions in ways that explain them away. Is one moved in the course of a psychedelic experience to the conviction that everything is perfect just as it is, that this earth on which we stand is the promised land, is the promised lotus land, and this very body is the body of the Buddha? And that's a quote from Akuin, Hakuin, and his song in praise of Zazen. The cybernetists will tell us why. What happens to produce that realization is that the neurological reshuffling that LSD occasions, the conviction center of our brain flip-flops to yes, green, go, while being wired to the euphoria center. Meanwhile, contravening impressions are short-circuited and shut out. This last is an important point, for it challenges the all-too-common, too vague, too uncritical claim that psychedelics expand consciousness. The balloon image that phrase suggests is less apposite than that of a microscope. Does a microscope enlarge our vision? Yes, by enabling us to see deeper into nature. But concomitantly, no, for it shuts out everything but the microscopic object at which we are looking. According to the artificial intelligent account, everything seems wonderful because at the moment in question, euphoria fills our horizon. The entire world seems wonderful because the world has been collapsed to include only the rose-tinted things we have in mind at the moment. As for the noetic property of the experience, the conviction that what one witnesses are not subjective phantasms, but realities that exist objectively in the world. William James listed this as one of the 4 marks of mystical experience, but artificial intelligence explains it away on grounds that novel experiences hit us with exceptional force because they are not glazed over by habituation, the loss of vividness that repetition breeds. The Freudian proceeds by a different route, but he too can discredit the experiences of the ego transcendence, the dissolution of the subject-object dichotomy, and the peace that passes understanding that entheogens occasion. There are variations of the oceanic feeling that results when subjects regress psychologically to their mother's womb. I do not defend these contemporary models of the mind. I merely point out that they saturate contemporary thinking to the point that even those who consciously reject them are imprinted by them to a larger degree. This makes it difficult to accept psychedelic theophanies at face value, but is not history studied with examples of sects that have managed to survive while holding beliefs that challenge reigning convention. A point well taken, and it takes to my second reason for doubting the staying power of psychedelic experiences. History shows that minority faiths are viable, but only when they are cradled in communities that are solid and structured enough to constitute what in effect are churches. To date, the psychedelic movement shows no signs of having within it the makings of such a church. Sporadic happenings in makeshift quarters and periodic gestures toward institutionalization do not challenge this assertion. They confirm it by their ineffectiveness. I say, no signs of the making of a church, but perhaps I should qualify that in one respect. The psychedelic movement does have a charismatic leader, a man of intelligence, culture, and charm, who is completely self-assured and apparently absolutely fearless. When Arthur Kleps, K-L-E-P-S, head of a branch of the short-lived Neo-American Church, testified before the Special Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Narcotics that we regard Dr. Timothy Leary with the same special love and respect as was reserved by the early Christians for Jesus, by Muslims for Muhammad, and by the Buddhists for Gautama. We sense the presence of charisma, the magnetism of a person who is regarded by his followers as an embodiment of spiritual power. A charismatic leader is a great asset to a movement, but his presence is not sufficient to ensure its success, and the psychedelic movement possesses other features which, if religious history provides grounds for prediction, augur against its becoming a genuine church. It lacks social philosophy. It is antinomian, and, ignoring the Taoist adage, to know 10 things, but tell only 9, it draws no line between the exoteric, which can be appropriately be made public, and the esoteric, which should be reserved for the initiated. The psychedelic movement is antinomian, derived from the Greek word meaning law. Antinomian is the belief that it is possible to advance in virtue to a point where one stands above the law and is entitled to lay aside its commands in the name of a higher morality. A historic example that sheds light on the psychedelic movement's antinomian tendencies and the problems that attend that stance is the Oneida community, a New York product of the religious revival that swept America in the 1930s. Its founder, John Humphrey Noyes, Noyes, became convinced as a result of his religious awakening and subsequent studies that the second coming of Christ did not lie in the future, but had occurred at the close of the apostolic age. He found the corollaries of his conclusion to be far-reaching. First, original sin having been effectively eradicated by Christ's unrecognized return, nothing remained in human nature to keep people from living perfectly right now. Second, once human beings do begin to live perfectly, no external guides for living can rival their own consciences and intelligence. Noyes was absolutely convinced that salvation without the law presented the central idea of Christ's gospel. But as his biographer G.W. Noyes points out, he found the doctrine exceedingly liable to be perverted, and the perversions produced 3 disruptive forces in his community: sexual irresponsibility, anarchy, and lethargy. Noyes' descriptions of these problems read like a warning to the psychedelic movement. According to the Oneida community founder, here's a quote from him, open quote, "Right action has 2 essential components, right intent and intelligence. Since these internal monitors might conflict with external laws, right action without freedom from external law was a contradiction in terms. Hence, Noyes and his followers, though brought up in the strictest school of New England morality, declared themselves free from law. But here a new danger appeared. In escaping from the law, many of the perfectionists, like the medieval mystics, fell into antinomianism. Antinomianism takes different forms according to the temperamental susceptibilities of its subjects. In those inclined to sensuality, it takes the form of lasciviousness. In those whose leading trait is self-esteem, it takes the form of anti-organization. In those of an indolent disposition, it takes the form of lethargy. During the prevalence of the antinomians, I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble with that word. I must apologize. During the prevalence of the antinomian aberration in 1835 to 1836, it seemed as though the Oneida community would be completely given over to anarchy and imbecility. The perfectionists did not abandon the principle of freedom from law, but they were brought gradually to the conviction that even the spiritually minded in the present stage of human development needed to be strained by moral forces, which, though consistent with personal freedom, were nevertheless, in effect, equivalent to the law." End of quote. I recommend to the psychedelic movement the example of John Humphrey Noyes. Here was a man who, in the name of religious convictions, advocated practices in comparison with which drug taking seems tame. In the interests of spiritual eugenics, he advocated that the law define them, and continues to define as adultery and bastardy. Yet here is the genius of the man. On this socially scandalous platform, and in the face of enormous public opposition, he founded a community of several hundred persons that prospered financially and spanned 3 generations, as against the average 3-year lifespan for utopian communities. An important factor in his success was his facing up to the tension between freedom and antinomianism in a manner more substantial than I find in his contemporary counterparts. Comparable lessons come from Asia, the source of much of which psychedelic movement's inspiration. The West picks up Zen's endorsements of freedom and spontaneity enthusiastically, and Zen does indeed celebrate these qualities extravagantly, but careful reading of the record shows that it presents them as the crown of years of arduous discipline. Kenneth Chen's Buddhism in China points out that advancement in the hierarchy of Chan Buddhism was contingent on a dozen or so years of intensive study of and discipline in the Vinaya, the first moral disciplines basket of 3 basket Tipitaka, a work so detailed in its moral injunctions that it would fill about a dozen good-sized volumes in a Western library. D.T. Suzuki picks up the thread and adds that even with this requirement in place, Chan, C-H'-A-N, and Zen still had to exercise great vigilance to keep from degenerating into self-effacing passivity and heresy known as quietism. To guard against this dry rot, Chan leaders introduced the requirement that monks work. The first rule of Chan monastic life was, "A day of no work is a day of no eating." This prompts me to ask if the corollary of turn on in quotes, and tune in in quotes, has to be drop out in quotes. To appeal to Asian traditions in support of antinomianism, be the traditions Chan, Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, or even Tantra in its Hindu and Buddhist versions, is to take their names in vain. To argue that there are things in religion that are best kept secret against our democratic grain, yet tested religions do so argue. There are pearls which cast before swine will be damaged themselves by trampling, or damage the swine should the swine eat them. In its earliest centuries, Christianity reserved a number of its dogmas for those who had undergone probationary instruction and had been baptized. The promise that was exacted of them, open quote, "I will not speak of thy mysteries to thine enemies," close quote, still appears in Orthodox Christian liturgies. Asia followed the same route. India developed the guru system, in which disclosures to disciples are calibrated to the disciples' capacities to comprehend them. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna forbids imparting higher knowledge to those who are not ready for it. And in the Katha Upanishad, Yama, Y-A-M-A, tests Nachiketas, Nachiketas, fitness in various ways before consenting to impart his highest teachings. In the Taittiriya Upanishad, Varuna puts off his son Bhrigu 4 times, with instructions to kindle the fire of his soul by inspiration, self-discipline, and meditation before imparting to him the knowledge of Brahman. And Raja Yoga, Yama and Niyama, Niyama, preliminary rules of discipline and purification are held to be indispensable prerequisites. India honors higher states of consciousness fully as much as today's psychedelic proponents do, but insists that they are assessed by persons who are unprepared for them. No, they are accessed by persons who are unprepared for them. One of 2 things will happen. Either, as I have said, the subject will be damaged, or the significance of the experience will be missed and the encounter trivialized. Thus, either the subject is damaged or the Dharma is damaged, usually both. The psychedelic movement pays lip service to these dangers by advising screening and preparing subjects, but on the whole it honors the esoteric distinction only perfunctorily. Inability to integrate the psychic experience with daily life is not without precedent. In the Chan/Zen tradition, early texts, in brackets, as John Blofeld has pointed out, Blofeld, tend to cite Satori as the goal of training. Later texts do not. The reason seems clear. When Satori first arrives, its monumentousness is likely to make it seem ultimate, the be-all and the end-all of existence. As life goes on, however, one recognizes that this is not the case. Routine asserts itself, and one discovers that even those who have had powerful Satoris sometimes misbehave. At this point, there enters the realization that comes to be stressed increasingly in later texts. In those texts, Satori is not the goal. It is the first major hurdle in the unending endeavor to work the Satori experience into the fabric of one's daily life until one's entire life takes on a Satoric quality. Drawing water, hewing wood. This is the supernatural power. This is the marvelous activity. Despite the fact that I do not see within the psychedelic movement the makings of a viable church, I hope that, as legal use of the entheogens seems destined for immediate future to be restricted in research, I hope that religious research will not be considered a contradiction in terms. If a sincere group wishing to use the entheogens for genuinely religious purposes were permitted to do so while qualified observers kept close check on what happens to the group and in the individual lives of its members, the results would be at least interesting and might be instructive. That is my conclusion. I append a short postscript. And here's the postscript. Strange things seem to be happening to human religiousness in our time, especially among the young. On the one hand, students are making left-end run around the prophetic. This worldly wing of institutional religion to tackle directly such issues as Vietnam, racial justice, and the problems of poverty. This has been evident for several years. What is new is that they are now making a right-end run around the priestly, otherworldly wing of institutional religion to link up with Zen, Tibetan, and Asian gurus of wide variety, Native American spirituality, channeling, and the New Age cornucopia, generally, including pharmacological mysticism. Theological supernaturalism is being replaced by psychological supernaturalism, defined as really belief in the existence of paranormal powers and their deliverances. Whether the current chapter of human religiousness is being written more in churches and ecumenical councils or on college campuses and in experimental communes is a question whose answer is blowing in the wind. And that concludes Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is entitled Historical Evidence, India's Sacred Soma. Till soon.